Hello, and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. Today I am talking about Kramer versus Kramer. The book is by Avery Corman and was published in 1977, and then the movie is directed by Robert Benton and was released in 1979. And if you watched my Jojo Rabbit video, you know that I recently made a goal to read/watch every Best Adapted Screenplay winner, and Kramer versus Kramer won Best Adapted Screenplay, so that is what led me to cover this. Out of the many options, this is the one I was drawn to because I love dramas, especially dramas that are about families and relationships. And for those who don't know, this is about a woman who leaves her husband and child, but later returns and wants full custody. And along with winning Best Adapted Screenplay, this also won Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Director. And the 8-year-old who plays Billy was also nominated for Best Supporting Actor. However, he did not win. And I'm just going to dive right into the details of the plot, which means there will be spoilers right away. So the movie starts with Joanna telling Ted that she is leaving, and she tells him that she is not a good mother and Billy will be better off without her, and that she doesn't love Ted anymore. And so I kind of like that the movie just gets right to it. But in the book, there was a bit more buildup because we hear about how he and Joanna met. We hear about a bit about her pregnancy. We hear about the day she gave birth and then time after Billy was born and what their life was like. And we hear in the book how, once Billy is a couple of years old, she tells Ted that she wants to go back to work. However, he quickly shuts her down and is like, no, that's not even an option. And he is just so dismissive of her feelings and how she just isn't loving motherhood and she wants something more in her life, basically, and how she just finds it really boring and unsatisfying. However, he is just not listening to her at all. And you can tell he's not listening to her because he suggests that they have a second baby. Like, are you kidding me? Like, that shows how he is just not taking her thoughts and feelings seriously. And he thinks the option about how she is dissatisfied with motherhood, he thinks the answer is for them to have a second baby, which makes zero sense. And so, yeah, in the book, we see all of this build up with her before she finally blindsides him by telling him that she is leaving. But in both book and movie, once she leaves, we see Ted as he struggles to adapt to life without Joanna. And in the book, this is extra difficult because in the book, Billy is only 4 years old. And so therefore he is not even in school. And so Ted has to find a housekeeper/nanny fairly quickly. Whereas in the movie, Billy is like 7. And so he's already in school. So that makes it a bit easier. And we also see how this affects his job. And I think the movie really highlights this because at the start of the movie, he is telling his boss a story about buying some expensive suit. But then later on, once Joanna has been gone for a while, he's talking to his boss. And now he's telling his boss a story about something cute Billy has said. And so we clearly see how his life and his priorities, they have just totally shifted. And when Joanna was still around, he had also hung out late at the office, but after she leaves, we see him declining after-work parties and drinks, and this ends up hurting his career. And in the movie, he is fired from his job due to him not being 100% all in. Whereas in the book, he lost his job, but it was because the company he worked for was bought out by someone else. And also at this point in the book, so he loses his job twice in the book. So this first time, his company is bought out and he is without a job for months. And it is an incredibly difficult time for him. And then eventually he does get another job. However, right before the custody hearing, he loses that job too. And so this time, the second time around, is when he is very assertive and he gets himself a new job within 24 hours because his lawyer tells him, but he also knows, if I show up to the custody hearing without a job, that is gonna hurt me so much. And so he is very assertive and he gets a job very quickly despite it being close to Christmas. And the movie only has him lose his job once, and they take the part where he gets a job within 24 hours. Whereas, in the book, he lost his job at 2 different points. And his life with Billy, once Joanna leaves, we just see more of it in the book. We see them make multiple trips to Fire Island. We hear about them going to Florida and Disney World. We also hear way more about Ted's dating life. The movie has one scene with him on a date with a woman, but in the book we hear about this much more. And also in the book, there is a scene when they're on Fire Island and he and Billy are sharing a bed and he brings a woman back to the bed and they cover themselves with a sheet, but they have sex right next to Billy where he's sleeping and, it's quick and they're quiet, but I was still kind of I don't have kids, but is that, it seemed weird to have sex right where your child is sleeping, right? Anyway, I thought that was odd. But something I liked about the book is how, he loves Billy more than anything. And Billy has become the center of his world. And yet we also see how he and Billy, they're so connected, and yet they also are getting on each other's nerves so much. And when they're in Florida, his sister-in-law sees this. And so she tells him like, hey, we'll take Billy to Disneyland for a few days and you can just leave and do your thing and you guys can get some space from each other. And I really like this aspect because it felt true that they would form this strong bond, and yet being around like just the two of them all the time, like it would make you very annoyed with each other. And in the movie, we get the scene when Billy eats the ice cream rather than his dinner, and this leads to him getting in trouble. And as Ted is taking him to his room, he yells like, I hate you. And Ted is like, right back at you. And so this is the movie showing the toll that this is taking on both of them emotionally. And it's a great scene. And yeah, I expected when I went into this book, I expected it to be more about the custody hearing, but really so much of this book is just about Ted and Billy and the bond that they are forming. And I thought the book did a great job showing this bond between the two of them and how Ted changes, and the movie also does a great job showing it on screen. And in the book at one point, Joanna comes back to New York for one day, and she spends the day with Billy, and then she goes up to Boston and sees her parents, and then she goes back to California. And then like a year later is when she returns and she has a meeting with Ted, and she tells him that she has been living in New York for 2 months and that she wants custody of Billy. And so the movie, they skip that initial visit and they just jump right to her showing up wanting custody of Billy. And in this moment when she's meeting with him in the book, and maybe you could pull this from the movie too, but it is explicitly said in the book how Ted initially thinks that Joanna is going to tell him she wants to make amends and get back with him, but he quickly realizes that this is not what this is about, and he is angered when she tells him that she wants full custody. And in both, he gets a lawyer, and the lawyer tells him to make a pros and cons list. And in both, Ted writes things in the pro for Joanna having Billy, but then he has a hard time coming up with the cons. However, we then read, when he began to write down the reasons for keeping him, the ideas did not flow easily. Professional benefits, he wrote just to get started. Ted believed that the fact that he had to take care of Billy had made him more responsible and more successful in his work. He tried to think of something else and he could not. He was blocked. He could not come up with any other reasons for keeping Billy. No reasons, nothing rational, only feelings. The hours together, the long, tiring, intimate hours of the two of them. How he tried to reconstruct a life for them after Joanna left. How they tried to come through it together. The funny stuff, the difficult times, the injury, the pizza, the part of his life that the boy had inhabited in his own special way. He is a part of my life now, and I love him. Ted took the list and he crumpled it up in his hand, and then he began to cry. It had been so long since he cried, it felt strange to him. He could barely remember what crying was, and he could not stop. I won't give you up. I won't give you up. And so in the movie, we get this as well. And right after he's trying to write this list, we see him then go and hug Billy. And so, yeah, I just love this scene in both book and movie. But also I wanted to point out how, again, in the movie, he loses his job because he is caring for Billy and because his priorities change. Whereas here, he feels like he has become a better person in every aspect of his life since caring for Billy. And he feels like he has improved at work due to this. So I thought that's, again, just an interesting change between the two and how they handled him losing his job and the reasons for why he lost his job. But yeah, so in both book and movie, they cannot come to a decision on their own. So then they have to go to a custody hearing to battle out who will have Billy. And the book, we got more testimonies on both sides and we got a bit more details, but the movie still stays true to the bigger events that happened during this custody hearing. And in both, we see how Ted's lawyer gives Joanna a tough go of it, and he has her say that she failed at marriage with Ted. And in the movie, she is crying at this point, and she looks to Ted, and he is mouthing the word no, meaning like she didn't fail. And so he's trying to comfort her as his lawyer is like badgering her on the stand. And I did like this scene in the movie, but this was not in the book. We have him tell her like, admit you failed. That is from the book. But yeah, in the movie, they added this part where Ted is trying to comfort her in a sense and be like, no, like it wasn't all your fault. And in both, Joanna's lawyer, when Ted is on the stand, he brings up the fact that Billy fell and almost lost an eye. And he brings this up to prove that Ted is a negligent parent. And then after this, specifically in the book, Ted walks up to Joanna and he says like, what a low blow that was to tell her lawyer that. And we then read, I'm sorry, she said. I just mentioned it in passing. I never thought he'd use it. Really now. Believe me, Ted, I never would have brought it up. Never. But the events simply had gotten beyond her. Both sides had their lawyers. The lawyers had their tactics. The lawyers and the tactics had a life of their own. And now both sides had hurt and had been hurt. And this line kind of reminded me of Marriage Story, which, by the way, so I saw Kramer versus Kramer when I was in my early teens. And so I had a vague memory of it, but I didn't remember like concrete details. But when I watched Marriage Story in 2019, I was like, isn't this basically Kramer versus Kramer? And while they are incredibly similar, they do have their differences though, of course, too. But I love the scene in Marriage Story when the husband and wife are sitting, not saying anything, and their two lawyers are the ones arguing with each other. But then I also wanted to mention a scene from Carol, which has stuck with me, and I think about it fairly often because it's a great scene and Cate Blanchett is incredible. But this movie too has a couple getting a divorce and they can't come to an agreement on who should have custody of their child or like how the custody should work. And so at one point near the end, Carol provides an option for her husband, which is more than reasonable, more than fair. And she tells him,
"You take it or leave it. But if you leave it, we go to court. And if we go to court, it'll get ugly. And we're not ugly people, Hodge."
And I love this because it shows how good, decent people can get pulled into this ugliness where both sides are, making low blows and hurting each other through their lawyers. And so, yeah, I just love that scene so much. And I think it's so powerful. And so she's asking him, like, don't let us become ugly people because that's not who we are. But back to Kramer versus Kramer. So in both, Joanna and her lawyer really go all in on the motherhood element and how a child needs their mom more than their dad and all of that. Meanwhile, Ted, he has witnesses as well as his own testimony that shows how Billy has become the center of his life and how he has been a consistent person there for Billy, And the movie has a scene that I loved where they are badgering Ted about missing work because Billy was sick. And they are saying this like a bad thing, like, he's not responsible because he left work early on this day there was an important meeting. But Ted is getting upset and he's saying how, I had to leave because Billy was sick, I had to go watch over him. And I love this because even though the lawyers are trying to show this as if it's a bad thing for Ted to have left work, the camera goes to Joanna and we see her realizing how changed Ted really is and how much Billy really does mean to him, because in the past he never would have left work early, right? And so, yeah, I just thought this was a fantastic scene, and Meryl Streep, her expressions just speak so loudly. And to kind of go along with this, I wanted to share a quote from the book. And this is when Joanna is testifying and she is talking about their marriage before she left. And as Ted is listening to this, we read, "It did not seem possible to him that he could have been so narrow. He could hardly recognize himself from the testimony. Yet he knew he had been that person they were describing, even though since then he had changed." And then in both book and movie, after the court hearing, the judge rules in favor of Joanna. So she gets full custody. And Ted is, of course, heartbroken. However, when it is time for Joanna to come pick Billy up in the book, first of all, she's like an hour and a half late. And then she calls Ted and she's crying and she's like, I can't do this. You can keep custody of him. We'll talk about this later, but she's just so overcome with emotion that she can't even talk. However, in the movie, they make the smart change where Joanna shows up at the building and she tells him, "I came here to take Billy home, but I realized he already is home." And then she goes up to see Billy herself. And so in both, she forgoes her custody in favor of Ted having him, but I liked in the movie how we see her show up in person. And in some ways, the movie does a better job of fleshing out Joanna and showing how she clearly had postpartum depression and it made her feel like a bad mother and a bad person. However, while in California, she says how she goes to therapy and she realizes that it's not true, she's not a bad person. And it also makes her realize how much she truly does want Billy in her life. And she's played by Meryl Streep, who of course gives a fantastic performance. But to go along with her feeling inadequate as a mother, in the book, we do get this scene early on before she leaves them where we read, "She wanted to wake him up and say, 'Billy, Billy, don't be 4, be 1, and we'll start all over, and I'll play with you and we'll laugh, and I won't yell so much and we won't fight so much, and I'll hug you and I'll kiss you and I'll love you very much, and the terrible 2s won't be terrible, and I'll be a sweet mommy, and 3 will be wonderful, and 4, by the time we get to 4, you will be my my little man, and you'll hold my hand on the street, and we'll chatter away about everything, and I won't be perfect, I can't be perfect, but I won't be mean, Billy, not so mean, and I'll care more, and I'll love you more, and we'll have so much fun. I'll really try if we could just start over, Billy. But she went into the kitchen so she would not wake him with her crying. And so I did think that was a great part of the book. But it's interesting because before Joanna leaves in the book, we do hear all of the emotions she is feeling. And yet, after that, once she leaves Ted, we no longer are hearing about her journey and what she is going through in California. And so I like that the movie does tell us about what she went through the last year and a half, right? And what her mental space was and how she has changed. And I read that Meryl Streep added in some of her own dialogue suggestions because she felt that in the book and original script, Joanna just came across as a villain and she wasn't very well developed. And I would agree because once she shows up and wants custody in the book, she does come across as the villain. And I think the author could have done a better job at showing things from her perspective. And so I think the movie does a better job at humanizing Joanna because in the book, I even read reviews where people were so mean to Joanna's character and how much they disliked her and she was so selfish and they just hated her so much. And it made me so sad to read these reviews because her story should have been so much more complex and nuanced. And I think one of the reasons it's also so important to help us understand Joanna is due to the fact that this book, it is making a point to show how the court system is unfairly biased towards mothers in these custody hearings. And so he is showing how powerful a bond can be between a father and son. But when he makes Joanna to be flat and unlikable to so many readers, the message is kind of ruined in a sense because he is taking almost a black and white approach to it, whereas the movie making Joanna more sympathetic and humanizing her much more and us understanding more fully why she left and what she went through, I think the message is even more powerful, right? Because again, the book in the beginning, he's showing us what Joanna went through, but then by the end, she's just not as fleshed out as she should have been. But in the movie, I also wanted to mention a scene when Billy is asking, like, why did his mom leave? And he thinks it's his fault. And Ted is like, no, like, it wasn't your fault. It was actually my fault, if anything. And he acknowledges that he tried to make Joanna be something she wasn't and something she didn't want to be. And he also admits that he was blind to her emotions and he wasn't paying attention. And he says, I thought when I was happy, it meant that she was happy. And I love this line too, because he was so self-centered that his emotions are all that mattered. And he just assumed like, oh, I'm doing fine. So Joanna, she's obviously doing fine too, right? And so we see through the course of the story how he becomes more selfless and more attuned to the emotions of others. And I know in this video, I am being very harsh towards Ted. And I just wanted to, to mention, to clarify that I don't condone what Joanna did, just abandoning her husband and child like that. But I also can understand her position to some extent, right? Like she felt trapped, she felt cornered, she was miserable, he wasn't validating her emotions. And so she was in a flight or like fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so she chose flight, right? And also, I've been in situations where, again, when you feel trapped or stuck and you have tunnel vision and you're not fully seeing all of the options you truly have, and so you feel like your only option is to stay or to go, like it's one extreme or the other. And so you choose to go because it feels like that's all you can do. And so, yeah, I guess I just empathize with Joanna. And so that is why I am being softer on her. But again, I don't condone what she did. But also I think we should see her in a kind light because she does realize her mistake and she does come back. And then, she does allow Ted to keep custody of him, right? And so she does make a good choice in the end. But obviously Ted is a commendable person throughout this story for, because at different points, people think he is going to send his son away to stay with like his brother and sister-in-law or with, the grandparents. But he's like, no, like I'm going to keep him and take care of him myself. And so I think both characters are very flawed in many ways. But I also think they both deserve compassion, and the movie especially, we see the full character arc that they both go through and how they both become better people by the end. And Joanna becomes someone, again, who goes to therapy and she learns that she has more options than she thinks she does and that she doesn't need to act in such extreme ways going forward. And then the only other significant side character in the movie is a neighbor woman who is divorced and had been friends with Joanna, but once Joanna leaves, she and Ted form a platonic bond over being single parents. And in the movie, at one point, Ted even accuses her being like, oh, like your divorce inspired Joanna to leave, and he almost feels like it's her fault. But again, over the course of the story, they form a very strong platonic connection. Whereas this is different in the book, because in the book, Ted is friends with this woman and her husband, and they are still married when Joanna leaves. And Joanna leaving Ted inspires this woman to leave her husband who had been cheating on her. And so I thought that was an interesting dynamic. But throughout the book, Ted remains friends with both of these people, even though they are getting divorced. And again, he forms a platonic relationship with the wife here. And also in the end, both this husband and wife come to testify on behalf of Ted. And so even though they are not on good terms with each other, they come together in order to support Ted. And in the book, we also get scenes with Ted's parents as well as Joanna's parents. And both sets of parents are there for Ted when he is raising Billy on his own. And they are there and they see the toll this is taking on Ted. And they see the effort he is putting into this and how Joanna has just abandoned them, right? And so even Joanna's own parents are there and see this. And yet during the trial, they testify on behalf of Joanna. And so Ted feels hurt by this. And yet they tell him like, hey, you would do the same thing for your kid. And then also we hear about Ted's brother and sister-in-law in the book. And I love this too, because the brother comes to visit. And this is when Ted is out of work and he's really struggling. And he and his brother, they just have a hard time connecting and they're just talking about surface level things. But then before the brother leaves, he writes Ted a check because he knows Ted is struggling. And Ted is just overcome with emotion by this generous act. And the brother also gets emotional and he's like, oh, like our family, we have such a hard time talking about things and we don't connect. And so the brother is feeling like he's wanting to fix this relationship and to really open up and connect with Ted, you know? And so I thought this was a great scene. And by the end, he is writing a letter to his brother. And he says how in the past he would have put like, regards, Ted. But in this case, he ends it with love, Ted. And then to move on to book versus movie. So yeah, this movie swept the Oscars. It won all of the major nomination categories. And yet for me, I wouldn't give it a 5 out of 5, but I did really like it. However, I just wanted it to make me feel emotionally gutted by the end. You know, like Ordinary People is just another incredible family drama. And that, like, I am just in tears by the end of that movie. And that is what I was wanting from Kramer versus Kramer, just like this intense drama. And even though we have great performances and a great script, it just wasn't as powerful as I had wanted it. And, you know, Ordinary People, that is a different story, but they are still both family dramas. So that is why I'm comparing them with each other. But yeah, so even though I did really like Kramer versus Kramer, I would not put it on my like top 10 list of family dramas. However, it is a great adaptation and I did like the changes they made because they stay true to the book, but they did a good job adapting it, like knowing what to cut, what to keep in, and certain sentiments in the book, they are able to convey that in the movie, like maybe in a different way, but still conveying that same message and the same feeling of the book. And the book actually did make me teary near the end, whereas the movie didn't make me cry at all, but maybe that's because I read the book and I knew what was going to happen. So as far as which one wins is kind of hard because, yeah, the book made me more emotional, but then in the movie, I really like that they do Joanna justice in the movie, I would say. So for that reason, I kind of want to say that the movie wins, even though I have been picking the movie a lot lately. Maybe I need to change my name to Why the Movie Wins because, I don't know, whenever I pick the movie a lot in a row, it almost makes me feel bad. But yeah, I think I would say that the movie wins. Also, the book, maybe before the custody hearing begins, maybe that part kind of goes on a bit too long, whereas I thought the movie did have better pacing. So yeah, I'll say that the movie wins. Thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know if you have read this book or seen this movie. As always, let me know your thoughts down below, and I will see you next time. Bye.